Streaming data, non-streaming data. I don't remember exactly. But we did complete MQTT and other things, no?
Yes, sir.
So then I think this is the one that we were looking at. So we were looking at data analytics for IoT applications. So now once you have all the data which has kind of come in from different solutions, different locations to you, the next step you have to do is to make sense of all the data which has come in. How do you make sense of all the data that is already available to you? You have to go for some kind of data processing. And now because you have the machine learning capabilities which are kind of reasonably good right now, machine learning is one of the key ways in which you tend to process the data and try to make sense of what is going on. Okay, so but there are some challenges which need to be worked out. So you can have like some usually what happens is when you did your machine learning course, you had a small data set, you could do the processing on the uh, on your individual laptops, or maybe you must have gone through Google Colab or something like that. You must have done. So now, unfortunately, the problem with IoT is that as the number of devices increase, the amount of data also begins to increase, and you do not know what kind of data is relevant, what kind of data is irrelevant, how much data to store, and how much data to process in one shot. So unfortunately, all those things have to be looked at before you kind of try to start making sense of the data that is available to you. Okay, so there are two ways in which you can see the data. One can be either structured or unstructured. We already, I think we talked about this. Structured data is the data which is kind of typically in the form of an Excel sheet, or typically in the form of a table, or in the available in the form of a database to you, where you have specific fields like you have age, which is always in floating point numbers or real numbers. You have address, which is always an alphanumeric string. So you have data which is in a very orderly fashion. You know that each field what kind of data should be available to you. So according to that, you can process them as per your requirements. Why is that important? That is important because as you learned in your machine learning course, uh, you cannot mix different data types if you want to do some any kind of machine learning. Numeric data types work in a different way when compared to string data types or categorical data. So you have numerical data, ordinal data, categorical data. They all need different kinds of machine learning algorithms to work with. Right? If you're using the Bayes classifier for numeric data, it works differently for Bayes classifier. It works differently for the other classifiers that you are basically like it differs differently for string data. It differs differently for numeric data. Another problem that you have is your data set could be stationary, or your data set could be moving or changing with time. So when that happens, you again have to look at how much should be the training window, when you should start retraining the system, should you be training it on the fly, then how much chunk data you should be taking. So many issues will come there also. Okay, and this is what I think we have already seen. There are different ways in which you can analyze the data. Descriptive, diagnostics, predictive, and prescriptive type analytics are possible. Descriptive data analytics is the lowest form of analytics, which basically says which gives basically an idea of what the data is about. Like if when you calculate the mean, median, standard deviation. Yes, am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what we do is when we are talking about basic descriptive data analytics, we usually talk about things like so doing the summary statistics of the data. What is the mean, median, standard deviation, etc., etc. You look at those, and then you see the data distribution and see if the data points which are coming are within the acceptable limits or within the plus minus 3 standard deviation, or are they going beyond that. If it is going beyond that, it is an indication that something is wrong. So on and so forth. There are several ways in which you do descriptive analytics, but they are the lowest form of analytics. They do offer insights into your data, but not to an extent where you want to kind of make some real progress on taking actionable what you say, outputs from the data. So for those kind of things, you have diagnostic analysis, which basically is what your typical classifiers and association rule mining algorithms, etc., will do. So they will be most likely for problems such as a fault detection or for problems such as in condition monitoring, etc. You do things like this. You do diagnostic analysis, which basically tells you that okay, this is what is happening, or this is the class to which the object is belonging. Like as a part of my research collaboration with other departments, I basically work a lot with mechanical engineering also. So one of the works that we have been doing is on identifying faults in big pumps. Like you have the huge pumps which actually pump water for industrial processes. So when they get damaged, they can kind of have a catastrophic cascading effect on the whole industrial process. So we do some work on trying to do both diagnostic and predictive analytics on those. So as a part of diagnostic analysis, what we do is we try to find out from the data which part of the pump has failed. When the pump kind of fails, immediately it will isolate and tell within, basically we have been able to do it within 500 milliseconds of the pump failing. I'm able to find out which part has gone bad. So there are several parts which make up a pump. So we can do that very easily using diagnostic analysis. I can isolate the fault and I can tell that this is the part which has gone wrong. Please replace this part. So that actually saves a lot of time for a supervisor or for a repair guy, because he just has to bring only that component with him and he knows exactly where he has to do it, and so the downtime can be significantly reduced. So that is one example of diagnostic analysis. We also do predictive analytics, in which case the same pump, if you see, I can predict when it is likely to fail. That is called predictive analytics. Right. So what we basically do is we try to see how the pump is behaving and how the pump performance is degrading over a period of time. That is done using machine learning, and we are able to project into the future when it is likely to fail. So in that way, I can kind of give them a window which kind of can be used as predictive maintenance window, where the system can be kind of can be made to undergo maintenance and brought back to its normal working condition. And if you go beyond the maintenance window of that, then we will basically run into failure and damage of the pump. So then again, breakdown maintenance will have to be done. Predictive analytics actually helps you kind of with those kind of things. You will be able to predict with a reasonable degree of accuracy when the system is likely to fail in the future and how much time do you have before you can rectify it. So that is the idea of predictive analytics. And then you have the idea of prescriptive analytics, which basically requires certain amount of expertise from the user also. And it kind of requires you to have a look at let's say basically kind of tell the customer or the person, in our case, if I'm talking about the pump, um, the owner of the company, we will just give them a recommendation that if you do these things, your pump's life will be most likely to exceed, kind of to go higher, or these components are the ones which are frequently failing, try to get it from some other better manufacturer, something like that. So that is the idea of prescriptive analytics. And as you know, the complexity increases exponentially as you go from descriptive analytics to prescriptive analytics. And obviously, from an industrial viewpoint, the value is higher as you go higher up the value chain. So the more amount of money that the company will be saving, or the amount of money that, obviously everything is about money when you are talking about industry. So it makes a lot more sense for them to go for to have better understanding of the processes, and therefore there is a lot of money, and there is a lot of you may say lot of advantages to looking at predictive analytics and prescriptive type analytics. Okay, can I go to the next slide? Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And we also saw some of the IoT data analytics challenges. you have scaling problems because IoT devices can be entering at any point of time. You could have the devices getting added as we go along. One example could be your connected car tech. As more and more number of cars get sold, more and more IoT devices are getting connected to your connected car system. I think Tata also has got it now. MG has got it now. So as more and more cars come into their kind of get to the customers, their IoT network is becoming bigger. And as their IoT network becomes bigger, they will have scaling related issues. So this is one of the challenges that they have to talk about. And also the storage of data, the volatility of data, how long you have to keep it, how long, when you should delete the data and replace it with newer one, so on and so forth. So several things are there. Another challenge is how do you process the streaming data, at what rate you should be processing, how much, what can you do with that data. So there are several constraints. How much processing power do you have? How many parallel streams you can work with? Several problems are there, especially when you have this massively parallel data streams. How do you deal with all of them at the same time is something that people are still working on. So once that is done, so these are some of the challenges. And now we'll just quickly go through some of the machine learning paradigms which are useful for IoT applications. This you have already done as a part of your machine learning course. So I will just quickly go through it. I'm just giving you an overview of machine learning. Whatever is possible with conventional machine learning, part of it can be used for IoT applications also. But please remember, the traditional machine learning that you may have learned requires you to have static data, which means you have an Excel sheet or something which you import and then you process it and do something. That's how you did it, right? I mean, like, how was your machine learning course? Did you use streaming data or did you do only fixed data, like from an Excel or from a CSV file you are importing and using?
Fixed data, sir. Fixed data.
Fixed data, you know? So yeah, so there are, so typically in IoT applications, you will have both kinds of data which are coming in, fixed as well as streaming. So this is typically how you classify your machine learning systems into multiple areas. So you have classification. Supervised learning is the major branch that we look at. So here is where most of the kind of IoT applications come in. Part of it comes under clustering also, because this is basically something like abnormal event detection and those kind of things can be done with the help of clustering. Supervised learning can give you ideas like diagnostics, kind of like some basic prediction algorithms can be done. So all those things can be done with the help of supervised learning, and this is also where most of your machine learning would have happened. Am I right in this? You must have done most of your machine learning with supervised learning, no? And you may have done some kind of clustering also. K-means clustering or something also you must have done.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, so that is how mostly it will be supervised learning, where you will be looking at some classification and regression, and there will be a part of work which will be done as clustering, which will tell you if the points that you are getting are abnormal or not. So abnormal event detection kind of applications in IoT can be done like this. For example, if you have too much of rain in one particular place, the data points will shift from the center point or the mean significantly, and you will be able to say something wrong is happening in that particular area, and then maybe you can just go and check if some localized heavy cloud burst has happened or something like that. Right? So clustering kind of applications can come in handy there. Then you have reinforcement learning, which we are not looking at as a part of IoT right now, because it's a totally different paradigm. So we'll not be bothering much about that. But all the other supervised and unsupervised is mostly what you will be using for IoT, making sense of IoT data. And then, yes, go ahead, please.
So what is that reinforcement learning actually?
Reinforcement learning, we typically, it's like semi-supervised learning, where we try to make, basically the idea is that you have software agents which try to learn on their own. So these are like small programs which try to kind of learn on their own or optimize their performance on their own. So for example, some advanced versions of that is what you will find in your video games today. You have this, there's something called enemy AI in shooter games. You have played that?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So I mean, like, I think you can set the level of enemy AI to different levels in some of the games. And you may have noticed that if you play the same game 2 or 3 times, you will find that if the opposing guys are coming from different directions or they're doing different things which you did not expect earlier. So they're learning from your behavior. Some of the games do that, some don't. But if you see that the behavior of the enemy is changing, enemy is basically run by the computer. So if the enemy seems to be becoming more intelligent every time you do the same game, it basically is an indicator that it's basically learning on its own. And how that it learns is basically using reinforcement learning. Okay. So you can have multiple applications. One simple application that I usually take in class is that of maze solving. It basically means that you can solve a maze using a very simple software problem without telling it where the actual solution is lying. The system will automatically, the program will automatically try to find the way out of the maze. If you extend it to further complicated things, you can get better results out of that. So most of the state of the art performance in optimization or in things like with game playing kind of applications are kind of being reported by reinforcement learning algorithms today. And deep reinforcement learning is something which almost everybody who's working in kind of proper machine learning is trying to kind of work on. Microsoft, Facebook, Google, everybody is into deep reinforcement learning, which basically kind of merges deep learning with reinforcement learning together. It's something that is very exciting, and in very near future you will see some great applications coming out of this. But it is not something that kind of runs exclusively on data. It requires you to, it requires the software agent to work with the environment. So basically it's like that is why game playing is so kind of relevant, because you have the game environment. The agent will be the person who's on the in the game, and the agent, when it goes up and down, it will learn. By falling down it will lose points, by getting up it will gain points. So based on the point scheme, positives and negatives, it begins to learn what it should do and what it should not do. So that's how typically reinforcement learning works. Okay, so navigation related and those kind of things are useful. And if you're interested, I will strongly recommend going through lectures of David Silver. Okay. I also have put some basic introduction to reinforcement learning in my YouTube channel. So if you are interested, go through that. Some very basic introduction.
So your channel's name?
Just Binoy Nair. That's it.
Okay. Okay, sir.
So if you go there, you will find some basic introduction. I do this for MTech level, so it may be slightly higher for your understanding, but it's basically starting from Markov decision process and goes on. Some very basic idea about what is reinforcement learning is there in my YouTube videos. I have like 5-10 minute YouTube videos, some 5 or 6 of them are there. So that should give you some idea of what is reinforcement learning. Okay, so I'll strongly recommend more technical details. There are lectures by David Silver. Professor David Silver's lectures on reinforcement learning. I'll highly recommend that. There are no very good textbooks because this is a very new stuff. So as far as textbooks go, there is very little that you can rely on. Okay, so yeah, well, let's get. Can we go to the next slide, or if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Sir, actually, in this, is there like minimal data at the base level, or there's no data at all, sir?
For reinforcement learning,
Yeah.
There is no data. Basically, what you do is you have. Basically, what you do is you create an artificial environment for the agent, and you let it loose in that, and you just put some criteria saying that if you do this, you lose points. If you do this, you gain points, like -1 +1. And
Okay.
the aim and the overall goal of the agent will be to maximize the points. So it will learn by doing different tasks, how it is increasing points and how it is decreasing points. Right?
Yeah.
I don't
Yes,
know if
sir.
you.
Yes.
I don't know if you have understood this, but there was a very a movie came very recently in Amazon Prime, I think. Ryan Reynolds, the free guy. You have heard of that?
No, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, like basically that is what reinforcement learning is all about actually. It is a very simplified way of what is say of representing what reinforcement learning is, but eventually your deep reinforcement learning agents will be kind of behaving similarly. Doing some things give you good values, and doing something else will reduce your points. So that's how you kind of learn to interact. It's a very simplistic way of telling an agent how to interact with the environment, but that is something that you have to do from your side. As somebody who's building the system, will have to decide which actions will lead to positive rewards and which actions will lead to negative rewards. That whole matrix you will have to specify at the outset. So that will basically decide how the agent is interacting with its virtual environment. And that is also one of the challenges with reinforcement learning, that you have to create a virtual environment in which the agent is behaving. So creation of that virtual environment, creation of an agent, and then you let loose the agent in that virtual environment. It will automatically pick up its own behavior by looking at this matrix, positive event, negative, positive, negative. And it will learn to do more positive actions than negative actions. So some basic machine learning is built into it. The matrix is there for positive and negative, and that's how it works. Okay. So yeah. Any other questions?
No, sir.
So let's go to the next question. Sorry, next point. And how do you do machine learning on the for system? You can do it either remotely or you can do locally. You already know this. You can do either cloud computing based or you can do on the edge. Okay. So you have done both most likely. Basic machine learning can be done on the edge if you have something like Raspberry Pi, or even very basic Arduino can be used for machine learning applications. You also have things like Colab, which you have already used for your lab experiments. So that basically is processing remotely. That is accessing your cloud computing services, and you're basically pushing the data into the cloud and getting the result from the cloud. So Colab is basically that. And what are the applications that you do for that are typically used in IoT? So you have either monitoring, you either do typically you do control, and you do optimization. These are the three major things that you usually do for IoT applications. Monitoring, just like what I explained, you can monitor heavy industrial equipment like pumps, etc., and see if they are working properly or not. If they are not working properly, you can create an alarm. You can continuously log the data into the cloud so that it is accessible to your bosses who may be sitting in maybe US or UK or somewhere else. So in real time, you could be monitoring the system's health. So and I think most of the automotive manufacturers now are also shifting into that kind of a mode. Tesla already kind of has some kind of diagnostics built into it, which will kind of warn the company beforehand if something goes wrong with the vehicle. So that monitoring is possible, and you can also have addition to monitoring. The next step on, once you monitor something, you can also go ahead with control, which basically means that you can remotely shut off a system, maybe try to remotely rectify the system slightly by changing the parameters, and so on. So monitoring and control are usually very closely linked. And you can also try to tweak the process changes. For example, like again, I'll take the example of companies like Tesla and Ford, etc., which are working on something like this. They're dynamically changing the behavior of the car based on the feedback from the driver. So you can think of IoT, each connected car as an IoT node. So based on several thousands of IoT nodes that are driving around on the road, you can collect a lot of data, and based on that you can tweak the parameters of the engine. You can change the rate at which your throttle response is controlled. All those things can be now done automatically. So that is where IoT's advantage come into picture also. Okay, please remember that IoT can be for devices as small as using your water level sensor to as complicated as a connected car. So the whole spectrum is encompassed by IoT. So operations or process optimization related stuff happen at a much higher level rather than at the device level. So that is something that you have to think. Okay. Can I go to the next slide? Hello.
Yes, sir.
So next what we will do is we'll go into something called the big data analytics tools. Typically we look at a lot of big data when we're talking about IoT. So usually you tend to use traditional big data platforms for dealing with IoT. Okay. So if you want to talk about big data analytics in IoT, what do you mean by big data? Typically is when you have data which is in excess of, say, usually in the range of terabytes, okay, say 50 gigabytes, 100 gigabytes, 200 gigabytes, and so on, terabytes, etc., petabytes. So you have massive amounts of data. So it becomes very quickly inefficient for you to train or to run it on a local system. So what you will need in that case is some way of splitting all the huge amount of data that you have collected into smaller chunks, and if possible process them parallelly. Okay. So that is the underlying principle behind big data. You split the data, you parallelize it, you process it, and integrate all the results together and present it to the person who's actually giving you the work as if this whole data is just one piece. So the splitting of the data and processing of the individual chunks of the data which have been created and integrating the results back into one single form, all this happens in the background. At the foreground, as for example, you are basically only going to give them the locations where the data is lying and going to tell them what you want to do. Rest of it, you will have to do a little bit of programming, but once you have done this, all of the background task is taken up by these big data tools that are available to you, right? And obviously you will have to look at these three categories before you kind of set up your system. What is the speed at which new data is coming, and how much quickly you want the data to be analyzed, what are the different types of data you're talking about, what are the volumes that we are looking at. So based on this, you will have to pick up how many nodes you will need, what is the speed of processing you will need, so on and so forth. And please remember, the big data processing is a slightly costlier proposition now. It's more expensive than running it on a single system and getting the results. And therefore, we have to be careful on how much data is being utilized and how much resources you want to use, how many your cluster should have, how many PCs, how many kind of parallel computing clusters you will need, and so on and so forth. That you will have to decide at the outset. So that is very important. And typically, you will find that the data is stored in most of the places in the form of data warehouses, or maybe as a form of relational databases, which basically means they are logging the data at a fixed rate and all the data is coming at a particular data type. So that is kind of very well structured and decent kind of data. You do not have any issues with different data types coming in and sorting them out and clearing them. So they are all kind of sorted and ready for you mostly. But the problem is that they will be usually very large in size. So if you have relational databases which are storing structured information, one major problem is taken away from you, which basically is on having unstructured data. If your data is unstructured, it is an additional level of headache that you have. You have to convert them into structured, and only then you can do proper processing. There are algorithms which will help you do that, but still it's a task in itself. So if you have already a very well arranged, neatly arranged data in the form of an Excel sheet or as a CSV sheet or a text file which is kind of comma separated properly, all arranged, then no problems. But if you have unstructured data, you have issues. Okay. So yeah, so basically to process that kind of data, you will have parallel processing databases. So how does this happen? How does this work? Basically, this works by taking multiple nodes. That means you split the data into multiple pieces or chunks, and then you send it over for processing. Just give me a second. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, okay. So let's quickly get on to the next topic that we were talking about. We were talking about massively parallel databases. So now in this, what happens is we talk, the presentation is visible, no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what we were talking about is that when you have such very large amount of data, you usually split the data across multiple nodes. You can actually create your own kind of distributed file system and do parallel processing if you have more than one computer with you. So you can have, and each of them will act as a node. So you can set up a server and then you can have a separate node, and they can kind of work. So if you have 3 or 4 old laptops lying together, you can connect all of them together and use them as individual nodes. You will find that your processing will kind of improve. So that's how basically it is done. And this is how typically the system will look like. So you will have a master and you will have several small hosts or slaves which will do part of the processing. So the controlling action is typically done by the master, And there will usually be redundancy built into the system. Otherwise, if the master fails, the whole thing will collapse. So you will have some kind of a redundancy, but typically you will have one master and then there will be several local hosts or local slaves which will do part of the processing, right? And NoSQL databases typically are ones which are used with deep learning. You will find NoSQL databases being used very commonly. The reason is that they basically work with uh, kind of all kinds of data. Typically, SQL or structured query language is a very old language. I mean, like even when I was in my bachelor's, we used to work with SQL. But NoSQL is typically something which supports both unstructured data and structured data. And this is kind of has a lot of advantages built into the system, which will help you process them much more quicker. Okay, so typically if you look at NoSQL, it has got these things which are part of it. So you will have document stores, you will have key value stores, wide column stores, and then you have graph stores. So these are different types of storages available as a part of the NoSQL database. So if you look at this, uh, you can store data which are semi-structured using maybe XML or JSON type databases. Each of them could be a JSON output. And then you will have key value pairs which are stored. Key value pairs we will see when we go into Hadoop, because it's a major part of something called the MapReduce system. And you can store them. And then you have the wide column stores, which basically is where you have, say, for example, how do I describe this? You can think of them as, I don't know, in C++ you have studied something like structures.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So there you will find that you have kind of totally disparate type of data kind of coming in at different place. You can have multiple different types of data coming together, right? So imagine a situation when you have a structure, but each field in a structure at different objects is different. Like you have, say, a third value in a structure is a string, but when a new object gets defined, the third value in a structure becomes a floating point. So you have for different objects, you have different formats. Why these kind of things happen? We usually don't find them very commonly, but it is possible that you may have a situation when the systems are getting modified or when upgrades are happening. You may think that changing data from float to string or string to float or character to integer may be better. So in those cases, the legacy databases, how they interface with this and how do you process them becomes a challenge. So therefore, you will have to have support for those kind of systems also. Okay. And then you have something called graph stores, which basically is something like you store the relationships between kind of data elements. Like basically, if you want to store information related, how one chunk is related to another. So that is basically done with the help of graph stores. Like for example, you may have done something with state machines, etc. So from one state to the next, you have a specific way in which the data will be going. So same way happens here also. Right. You've studied finite state machines, FSMs, in digital maybe.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So there basically you know that from which state the data will move, or the what will be the next state after a particular state, right? Like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. So you know from which state the data is moving to which state. So that is the idea here also. So you know from which chunk or from which data section you are moving to which other state. So that basically is something like a graph store. So interrelationship between variables and interrelationships between data is stored in the form of graph stores. We may look at it kind of NoSQL if time permits, but we'll quickly move on to the idea of Hadoop. I think I have about 2 minutes to go, so I'll just give you some basic understanding of Hadoop. Did you do something on Hadoop in your machine learning course?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Okay. So Hadoop is typically the major framework that is kind of used worldwide for dealing with big data. So if you have large amounts of data, how do you deal with that? Is typically with the help of Hadoop. And Hadoop and Spark basically. If you are working with streaming data processing mainly, you look at Spark also. So it's basically a part of the Hadoop ecosystem and variations that we have. So typically Hadoop came out as a part of the efforts to manage data for very large repositories. Obviously the pioneers were Google and Yahoo because they have issues with providing search results and scanning and all those things, right? So what are the major characteristics? Why do you need to kind of go for Hadoop? The reason why typically Hadoop is preferred worldwide for big data is that it is reliable. Why? Because data is split into multiple chunks and parallel processing happens. So if parallel processing is happening and one of the nodes or two of the nodes go bad, the system will not fail. You have multiplicity of there's something called replication which happens. So because of the replication of the of what you may call as the chunks, you have significant amount of reliability built into the system. So the common question that people usually would ask is that if I split my work into 10 pieces and run it on 10 computers, if one out of the 10 computers fails, what will I do? Because the whole system will not, the results will not be complete unless I get that result also. Because the results have to be got back and they have to be integrated and presented. So if 1/10 of my work is still pending, how can I show the results? But in Hadoop, reliability is something which is built in. So even if your 10th system fails, there will be replicated chunks which will be running on other systems also. So it will create an overhead, obviously, but you will have redundancy as a result. So instead of just splitting the data into 10 chunks, you will first divide it into 10 chunks and then replicate each of those chunks by factor of 3. So you will end up having 30 chunks in total with 3 copies of each chunk. Usually you can have more chunks or you can have more replication also. So what will happen is that and each of those chunks are basically randomly kind of distributed across the cluster. So even if one cluster fails or something, a copy of that will be running in some other system and you will not fail or you will not lose all of the information. So that is where reliability is a feature of Hadoop. And obviously scalability, because you can add and remove as many systems you want to the cluster, and the system and Hadoop will automatically scale it up or down. It will automatically split the data into better, bigger or smaller chunks based on the available amount of resources you have. And the third factor is that it does not require you to have a very huge computing infrastructure. You don't need to have only tensor processing units or things like that, or maybe NVIDIA clusters to run this. You can run it on your simple laptops also. You have 3 different laptops or 2 laptops, you can set up a Hadoop cluster, no issues. And then you have something like distributed processing. Obviously, it's a factor of the parallel processing that you are going to use. Processing will happen independently based on different systems. Storage also is distributed because it's going to sit into some other place. And fault tolerance, this is tying up with the first one. It's a part of the reliability process. And as I was saying, replication factor of 3 is used. So if you have data, it's divided into chunks. Each chunk is copied 3 times and put randomly into different systems, so that even if 1 or 2 nodes go up or get damaged, you still have the data in some other system. Obviously, you will have the overhead. It can go to 300% usually. So because it's 3 times, so you have 3 times the load. But the only thing is that because you are using small chunks, each system is getting loaded only very little bit. So that's the whole thing. And this is how the whole Hadoop architecture looks like. You submit the work, it goes into the master will divide the work, and finally you get the result and you get the work back. Okay, so this is how a typical cluster will work. Same thing will happen at the back end if you are using Google Colab or something like that also. All this is encapsulated from you. You will not be able to see this. When you submit the data to the Colab browser window, at the back end, this is what is happening. And I think you have the options to buy extra hardware also. So if you want to buy extra hardware, you are basically trying to get more nodes or getting a space in different nodes so that your work goes faster. Okay, so I will stop with this for now. Is there any questions?
No, sir.
Fine, so we will continue with Hadoop in the next class, and hopefully we'll be able to wind it up in one class or so. I'll quickly go through this. I'm not going into the technical details of this because it's a complicated thing in itself. So I'll just give you some theoretical overview of what it is about. But if you are interested, maybe you can pick electives which will be on this. So there are a lot of courses available which can help you with this. We'll see if there are courses available in your higher semesters. You can pick this as an elective. Okay, fine. So just give me a second. I'll take down the attendance and then you can go. Okay. Okay then. Thank you all for attending. We'll continue in the next class. Bye.
Sir,
Yes.
any information about the IoT read test for the lab component?
Piyush sir said he will set it up today or tomorrow. He's in charge of the lab exam. So he said he will inform.
Okay, sir.
I think the representative may be contacted.
Sir, but we haven't got any information, sir.
I talked to him yesterday. He said that he's setting it up, and he will let you know.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
So for the assignment given, sir, the solution part, can we put the existing solutions or something new has to be done, sir?
Which one?
So the yes,
the
sir.
final smart city assignment.
Yes, sir.
No, your suggestions are also what we need. Like,
Okay.
how do you think it can be incorporated? The try document that I have given is something that government has kind of put out as a possible roadmap and possible set of solutions. But you may also have some of your understanding. I'll appreciate if you can provide kind of some of your understanding on what can be done.
Okay, sir. Yeah.
So better than just copying and pasting. No? So I mean, like if you learned something, I'd like to know what your people would think on that.
Okay. Okay, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, sir. Like if you think of our existing solutions, there may be some drawbacks also, sir. That
Yes,
was
obviously. Correct.
thing.
Correct. So you can kind of give your own recommendations on what needs to be done and so on.
Okay, sir. Yeah.
This is usually something that I kind of give to MTech level students. But because I think that some of you have a good understanding of what is going on in relation to IoT, so I'm not putting any constraints on what you can write and what you cannot. So based on your understanding, please do this.
Okay, sir.
Issues. Yeah. All right, then if there are no questions, I think we can break now. Yes.
Yes, sir. Sure.
So thank you all for attending. Bye.